it's wonderful to be here with Malaprops virtually, and it's always great to be with Ralph in person and virtually. It's interesting. We're going to spend the next 40 minutes or however long we're here talking about actual places, and we're going to do that from this scattering of virtual places, and that's just the life we're in right now. I really think this book and really Ralph's vision, literary vision, which if you've not read his other books, you should. But his understanding of Mississippi is so relevant to this moment. It's relevant to history, but it's also relevant to this moment. And he doesn't need me here to tell you about it, but but here I am. And so I'm going to say a few things and try to guide. I do encourage you to ask questions, make comments, whatever. There's a lot to talk about. There's a plethora in this book. We could take one little, to use Faulkner's, one little postage stamp area of this book and talk all night. But Ralph, let's start with sort of how you tell this story of Mississippi in the literary imagination, beginning at the Gulf Coast. And we were talking before, just a minute ago, about how so many stories of Mississippi, so many guides to Mississippi, the piney woods and the Gulf Coast are sort of the footnote to the tour. We begin there. Talk about that and that choice and that vision.
Well, I mean, my inspiration for that, excuse me, was really Natasha Trethewey's Theories of Time and Space. When I was thinking about this book, I was thinking about that poem about Highway 49 dead ending at the beach at Gulfport and looking out, over to Ship Island and bringing that tome of memory and blank pages. And I realized that the Gulf Coast is a place that a lot of people think is the end of Mississippi. It's a place that's always reinventing itself. I think that's why it's a place to start, because there's an idea of Mississippi that lives on the Gulf Coast, this idea of reinvention that is like nowhere else in the state. So that's why I really chose to begin there, moving up through my native Piney Woods, the place that only gets maybe 2 sentences in the WPA Guide to Mississippi.
Right.
And really guiding you through that, and then going into the part of Mississippi that I think most people really do begin to think about with Jackson and Vicksburg. That idea of Noel Polk, who was the great Faulkner scholar, who said that these were the parts of Mississippi that existed beyond the Southern myth. And I wanted to start with those that began beyond the Southern myth.
Mm-hmm. I always liked that Noel Polk was from a town named Tiny Picayune.
Yes.
Anyway, that's another. And you mentioned the Piney Woods, and I have to. You have this wonderful quote that gets at a lot of the underpinnings of what you're talking about. It's the sort of darkness and the light of literature in Mississippi, but from the Piney Woods, Will Campbell's quote, "Happiness was not part of the contract."
Yeah,
it's such a. I had forgotten about that, but it's such a concise, hard-edged, as only the Piney Woods would have, statement about just what life was like, and that is your region. I mean, that's the region that made you.
Yes, it is, and I went into Will Campbell's part of the state, which is also Anne Moody's part of the state, looking at both of those places, and you can feel their presence there. I mean, it's interesting to me. I was, in my class today in Southern Studies, we were talking about Southern literature and place. It's kind of part of where we are in the semester, and I told them about going down the Anne Moody Highway, thinking about where that shack would have been, that by that lake where they went and got their water, and I found it. It didn't take me. It's with the book there on the seat next to me, reading it while I'm stopped on these back roads, and I find the place.
Wow.
And that's just how connected she was to that. Just like Will Campbell, I don't know if he necessarily described the place as much, but he described how the place made him feel.
Right, right. Well, I think that's so elemental and to this book is your being there. I mean, you're not just, you haven't arrived in Mississippi from some other place, fascinated by the literature, which is, there's nothing wrong with that in writing a book. But I mean, you're from the house at the end of the road. You're from that place. You've written books that people will write books about, and you're writing a book about people who write books.
It's very meta, isn't it?
It's very meta, but it's also very engaged, and it gives it a level of understanding and of lyricism that is uncommon in books about a state, about the literary landscape of a state. I think that you being, having you've written your own books, and now you're writing about people that write those books, and making choices and understanding the landscape, and where to go. And at the same time, you're teaching about it. I mean, it's very very applied.
It is applied, but it's also heartfelt. I mean, it's I guess I didn't realize. I mean, I identify with Mississippi. I always have, even though, as I told people, I stripped the map of Mississippi from my tongue. But coming back here and writing about its literature, made me engage with the place with a degree of intimacy, which I don't think that I really ever had before, even writing 2 memoirs. Because I was not only thinking about the way that I experienced the place, I was trying to look at it through the eyes of other writers and how they also experienced the place, and seeing where they overlapped. My first drafts of this, my editor said, "Well, you're really keeping yourself out of this narrative a lot. I want more of you in there, because there are things that you know about this place that
Right.
no one else is going to be able to write about them." And I guess it gave me license to kind of to go into the little more personal asides that I have here.
Well, it also gives you access, I think, to both understanding what you're hearing and looking at, but also access to people to talk to them about their work.
Yeah. I mean, really, it really did. People were very willing to talk with me. Jessamine Ward was very willing to talk. Actually, I was going to interview Natasha, and I went to hear after she gave a lecture at Millsaps, and the lecture, it was like the lecture that blew me away. It's like, I don't have anything else. I mean, you just did it for me.
Right.
She just laid it all out there, and I said, "Can I have a copy?" And that was it.
Right. And you just said something that reminded me of Kisei Lehman's quote in there, where he says that he doesn't want to represent Mississippi or the South, or translate it or synthesize it, but he wants people to just kind of love it, and the passion, and the complexity of the passion. I mean, and I guess you're going to read, but before we end, I want you to talk about the complexity of the silence, the things unsaid.
I mean, I think the silence is where the stories are very often buried, and I dig into those a lot to kind of find stories. It's why, one of my friends at UVA says, "I'm never surprised, always surprised by how many Mississippi stories there are." It's because there's so much people are silent about. But with Kiesei's quote, Kiesei's quote reminded me of one of your Duke colleagues, Mark Anthony Neal, his idea of a post-soul aesthetic. This group of writers and artists who were born after the March on Washington, and
Right.
well into the 70s, and the way that they view the culture of the South and their connection with it. It's free of that historical burden of the civil rights movement, which is refreshing. I mean, it's one of the things that, I mean, I've told Casey, I said, I don't look at a central Mississippi sky the same way anymore because of you.
Right. And you refer to it as the post-integration blues.
Yep, post-integration blues. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, why don't you, you have something you'd like to read?
Yes, I do. And I'll start here with, since it's St. Patrick's Day, with Mississippi's comparison with Ireland, which, I mean, I have to say my own native Piney Woods, I understood a lot better after going to Ireland. Like Ireland, Mississippi's history is filled with suffering that must be explained. It is a place that comes alive in its stories and inspires those stories, which flow through every bend of its winding rivers and across every piece of land within its borders. It is the beauty of the land mixed with the state's complex history that inspires and perplexes its writers. That is the burden one feels when writing about Mississippi, because it is a place that everyone knows about, or at least claims to, yet few are willing to understand. For better or for worse, Mississippi has become a metaphor for the entire South, and for that matter, the entire nation. As Malcolm X said, as far as I am concerned, Mississippi is anywhere south of the Canadian border. A story about race set in Mississippi is as much about the sins of the nation as it is about the sins of the Magnolia State. The American South and Mississippi in particular have existed never so much as a literal place than a figurative one, writes noted historian and Mississippi native Joseph Crispino. The Southern writer is forced from all sides to make his gaze extend beyond the surface, beyond mere problems, until it touches that realm which is the concern of prophets and poets, Flannery O'Connor wrote in her essay, Some Aspects of the Grotesque in Southern Fiction. She very well could have been writing about Mississippi writers, since they all feel the need to describe the place with the greatest of intimacy, yet in a way that makes what is unique about Mississippi resonate with an air of universality. It is Mississippians' obsession with place, people, politics, and history that leads its writers to use the state to contemplate larger existential arguments with the greater world. The extremes in Mississippi's politics, history, and people leads to what Brad Watson calls a high-octane treatment of place, which in turn leads to more critical poking and pondering. Perhaps that is why one of the most quoted lines from William Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom comes from the character Quentin Compson, who, when asked to explain the South, says, "You can't understand it. You would have to be born there." When pressed about why he hates the South, "I don't hate it," Quentin said quickly. At once, immediately, "I don't hate it," he said. "I don't hate it," he thought, panting in the cold air, the iron New England dark. I don't hate it. I don't hate it.
And we could argue that if a Southerner who's awake that hasn't ever had those kind of thoughts, even whether they read Faulkner or not, wasn't really awake.
I would agree with that. I mean, it's I think there are times that I'm quoting Quentin Compson. I don't hate it,
Right.
And maybe even sometimes saying I love it too much.
Right.
It is that real it's that real conflict, which I think it's very difficult to describe. My wife is a Westerner. This is very difficult for her to understand. Westerners are all about looking ahead, that idea of the frontier and reinvention.
Right.
Southerners said, you're all obsessed with your history. And we are, because the place is haunted. It's just haunted.
Well, in some ways, it's more interesting than what's up ahead.
I think that it is. We don't know what's up ahead. We know what's behind us, and sometimes we don't look at what's behind us closely enough to even think about what's ahead. I mean, it's as I say, if you can find the past and the present in Mississippi, there's something else in the world that you can really understand.
Mm-hmm. Well, the in Natasha's Trethewey's South poem, where she says, talking of Mississippi, a state that made a crime out of me, and then she goes on to talk of herself as be buried native in her native land. I mean, when I read the first time I read that poem, I mean, how could one person sort of in however many lines get all of that complexity and darkness and ability to still say, well, but I'm still from there. It still is native.
Yes, I mean, it's very hard for me to. I know people who've left and say they will never come back. I mean, I was one of them. I thought I was never going to be back here. But I think my life would be much less rich for not having returned. And as I tell people, I do kind of keep one foot in and one foot out, if only to maintain my perspective, kind of being an insider in Mississippi, but also as someone who's been away looking at it from the outside. I think that was probably when I came back to teach at Millsaps College in 2016. That was my first extended time of living in Mississippi in almost 40 years. And I think that's when I began to see the place very differently. I think that was kind of the beginning of this for me, and spending so much time really returning to my old haunts and driving around the state. So when the opportunity to write this book came along, I guess I've been spending several years getting ready for it and didn't even know that that's what I was doing.
Right. Well, I think, and I do think it is that having one leg, being able to be of Mississippi and outside sort of simultaneously, that makes your voice in this book sing as it does, and have the insight that it does. I don't think it's possible to do a book like this well without that. And that's complicated in itself. It's a racial complication. It's the fact that you can understand. Now I'm not even asking a question. Turning it into a question, but it seems. I mean, don't you think you have more insight into, if we're going to call it a post-integration blues, more insight into that than just any other? I mean, than others might.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's not theoretical for me. Like
Right.
I said, it's very real, and I guess that is the difference. It's part of my life. I mean, it's interesting to me when I teach some of the books that I mentioned here. I begin to see the impact that they have on my students, and I begin to engage with those texts in a very different way. So to tell people, reading, Black Boy when you're 16 in Mount Olive, Mississippi, and then teaching it at 62, it's a very different. And then seeing other people. I mean, for me, when I read Black Boy, it was very real. For my students, I remember one of my students said, "This is a work of fiction, isn't it? This couldn't have happened to anyone."
Right.
And that's, and having to explain to them, yes, this was the life that people lived, that Black people lived. And that's difficult to see, but it's a great challenge of trying to get them to engage with that and understand that. By the end of the semester, I see a big difference in the way that they look at the place as well. I think that's probably the most gratifying thing for me.
When you talk about Welty's "Where's the Voice Coming From," which is something I've taught a lot and tried to think about it figure out, how does somebody know so well a place that they don't actually have to see what happened to know what happened. I mean, we talk about the imaginary in the academy,
Yeah.
or and here's a piece that is, and we talk about the documentary imagination in documentary studies, and people question, well, how can it be documentary if you weren't actually there? What about, where's the voice coming from? I mean, where does it fit?
It's really, it's very difficult to understand how someone was able to inhabit that mind of the murderer. I've looked at all the drafts of that story, and you see how the story evolved. You see the level of detail that Welty got in her first draft, that she begins to pare back a little bit and take you deeper into the mind of that person. And as she said, it was the only story that she ever wrote in anger.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you see twinges of that anger. I always go back to that story pretty regularly, because it's like, how did she do that? How did she know what was going on in that mind? As I've told people, I think that story probably had more influence on white moderates who were on the fence about the civil rights movement than anything that could have happened during the civil rights movement. Yeah, that murder could have happened and people would have ignored it because of that story. There was a class of people, and it was a small class of people, mind you, who then realized, I can't ignore this anymore.
Right. Yeah, and I think I would argue that a lot of us might have known that, but to channel it, to access it. I mean, I think what that story sort of tells you is, you may like to think you don't know that person, but I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's a deep well that she went into herself, and that, I mean, that's the thing that really gets me about that story. Is it happened, and there are other stories that are like that, and I have to say it is a difficult story to teach, because the students don't want to be in that mind. I mean, I was teaching this last fall after the events of last summer, and no one really wanted to be in that mindset.
Right.
And when I started to get them to think, well, think about the person who had their knee on the neck of George Floyd. How different is that? And then they began to see, I think it was that it was getting them to inhabit a place they didn't want to be.
Sure. Yeah. It's hard to admit that that you could access that place.
Yeah. And I think Eudora knew she was going to make people uncomfortable, and I think it made her uncomfortable. I mean, that's one of the reasons that she wrote, Must the Writer Crusade, comes right after that. And so I always joke, Eudora, you wanted to have it both ways. But I think she also is saying, okay, no, you're not necessarily, this is not a story that crusades, but a writer must have a point of view. And Eudora did have a point of view.
Mm-hmm. Right. When you this is a book about a place called Mississippi, right? It's about Mississippi. Is it a big love letter from Ralph? Is it a treatise? I mean, how do you see it in terms of it's kind of emotional chord as a book?
Well, there's this joke among Mississippi expatriates that Mississippi is not a state, it's a club. And I was trying to kind of stay out of the kind of clubby side of it. And that's one of the reasons that I ended the book at Parchment, because realizing this is the poorest state in the Union. Mississippi is the poorest state in the Union. There are a lot of people who aren't in that club.
Mhm.
who don't have that gold card of being a professor at the University of Mississippi.
Right.
That's not something they have. And, my drives up and down the Delta, going past Parchman, made me begin to think about that, and made me ask, Louis Bourgeois, could I go to your classes at Parchman? Because I've read some of the work of the writers out of those classes. I want to meet some of them, and I want to experience what those classes are like. And realizing that I was driving past a place where there are other writers who may never have their work on the page. Thinking about Etheridge Knight and
Mhm.
realizing that he's arrested in Indiana for stealing $10 from an old lady, put in prison, is educated in prison, and catches the attention of Gwendolyn Brooks and becomes this renowned poet.
Right.
If he'd been in Parchman, he would have been out there chopping cotton. He wouldn't have had any time to write poetry.
Right. Right.
And realizing how many people who would have had that same twist of fate are in those prison walls right now.
Mhm.
And that's one of the reasons I wanted to kind of, leave, instead of sticking with kind of the club,
Right.
who's not in the club.
Right. Yeah, I
Um,
think that was a brilliant move. And I think it also, back to this thing of us joking about the past being more interesting, that is a way to really put it in the moment, in the contemporary future moment. If that's, you're really looking at the vista, forward, looking out the whatever the metaphor is, looking out the windshield at where we're headed. And or trying to. I mean, we don't know, but I think that was really just as wonderful as starting from the Gulf Coast, sort of ending at Parchman. It's counterintuitive, but it's not just counterintuitive. It's deeply, profoundly intentional, and I think it really does work.
I mean, there are two things that I want to do post-pandemic. One, I want to have a drink at City Grocery.
I'm in.
And second, I want to go back to Parchman.
Uh-huh.
I want to go back to those writing classes at Parchman, because I really liked the men I encountered there, and I felt a real connection with them, and they did with me. And they've asked me to come back, but I said, only once this is all over. I
Right.
can't do it right now.
Yeah.
But Louis Bourgeois is still teaching at Parchman in spite of it all.
Mhm.
So he's someone, I think, who is to be admired for his commitment to that.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, I think that's, I think that the whole idea of outside the club, and so many of the writers that are in this book wrote them. If there is a club, they wrote their way into the club.
Yeah.
They didn't start there.
No, none of us really started there.
Yeah.
And even though I know people see me as part of that club, I don't necessarily see myself that way, which is, to be honest with you,
Yeah.
being honest, I love the work of Richard Fort. I don't see myself as being in his, at his club. I love Eudora. I don't see myself being in her club either. But yet I think people would place me there. But that's not a place I can do. I can put myself there myself.
Yeah. Well, I think they need to read Ever Is a Long Time. They need to read the whole, all of it, and they can put you at City Grocery for that drink.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the post-pandemic days when I can have that freedom and to gather with people again. And it's such an amazing writing community in Oxford. There's a photograph inside with I got 29 of the 40 working writers in Oxford together, inspired by the Great Day in Harlem photograph.
Yeah, I saw that. That was great. That's a great photograph.
And I really love having your photograph of Larry Brown there,
Well,
I think really captures the essence of Larry Brown
I'm
in his bass boat
yeah.
with his fishing rod out.
Yeah, I'm so glad Larry's in there, and we could talk. We could go on and talk about. There's another one that sort of came from the end of the road down the road and started writing, and I think that. But we probably ought to open it up to questions. I'm trying to keep track of time a little bit. Not that I'm the timekeeper, but it's 6:35. Stephanie, are there questions that? Okay, here's one. I'm out to. Let me get my. I got to get out of full screen to see the chat. Sorry. So the question: can you talk about or describe some of the work by writers at Parchment?
Yes. I think the strongest thing is memoir. Memoir. Some of the poetry, but particularly the memoir. And there's one line, and I can't remember the name of the writer, but where he says poverty comes with an entourage, and that line really stuck with me. And he goes on to describe what that entourage is and how, and it's what made me think about how many people who are in Parchment are there because the education system in the state failed them.
Right.
And then, there's a similar program in the women's prison, and I read a lot of those stories. I didn't go into that prison, but I read a lot of those stories and realizing that a lot of those were accounts, memoirs of abuse. And so, so you think, well, there's a lot of this trauma, but then there's something that these writers have done that gets brought out of them is they're trying to understand their trauma and actually trying to get the people who are reading it to understand that as well. And those are the stories that really capture my attention.
And could you see Word beginning to teach there as well, or like Lewis is?
Yeah, I did a guest lecture there at the Poetry of Etheridge Night,
Yeah.
which was a lot of fun. It was really interesting, and seeing how they responded. Etheridge Night was this poet of the belly, and I was really trying to. I looked at some of his readings, and I was trying to evoke that when I was reading from his poems, which are often quite profane. And they liked the poetry. It's really interesting thinking about this now, but they didn't like hearing that profanity come out of my mouth. They didn't think that needed to come out of the professor's mouth. Mm-hmm. And that was something that was really, that has stuck with me. Right.
One of the things you do so well in this book, but I would imagine lots of other places is think about and write about photography and its narrative connections. You do it with Welty and here, and with Bill Ferris's work, and your use of photography throughout the book. Do you teach? Do you bring photographs into the class? Do you think about photography a lot?
I think about photography a lot. I teach a class on the image of the American South, where we really begin with Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. We kind of go up, through some contemporary photographs, reading Sontag and Barth. So understanding some of the ways that people write about photography. I think my favorite book on photography is Jeffrey Dyer's The Ongoing Moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'd say that idea, he said that peculiar alchemy between the visual and the verbal, that's been a big inspiration to me in my work. My years at the Library of Congress, I think I probably worked on maybe 40 different photography books.
Yeah.
During my nearly 20 years there. Right. So I didn't realize that's what I was doing, and was kind of connecting that the visual and the verbal, but that's indeed what it was, and how much painstaking detail we paid to captions, where the text was placed. And I thought a lot about that here. I also thought a lot about what's the right image to have here. Also discovering that, the South, Mississippi is, very well documented photographically, but my region is the least documented photographically.
Sure.
So I was even trying to say, went to David Wharton down the hall from me in Barnard Observatory. Said, "So what do you got in the Piney Woods?" I got nothing. So I had to go and shoot some of the contemporary stuff of the Piney Woods myself, because it didn't exist.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not surprised. For those of you that don't know, Ralph was director of publishing at the Library of Congress for 20 years. So that's what he's referring to. Here's a question. Let's see. So you talked about how your relationship with books like Black Boy has changed over the years. Is there anything that has surprised you about those changes? Any surprise when you revisited the works to write this book?
I think probably the biggest surprise for me was having to think about the way that Wright was trying to tell his story in a world of publishing that didn't necessarily want to hear parts of that story. Realizing that the book ended originally with his getting to Memphis before he gets to Chicago, and doesn't even deal with the whole part of his being in Chicago, which is a very fascinating story as well. But the North wasn't willing to look at their racial issues at that time, and realizing that I have a lot more freedom than Wright ever had and could ever feel. And I think that's the thing that probably comes back to me the most about it. Reading it younger, you're thinking about this story, about this place where you are from. But now, being a writer, having been edited, going through this and realizing how that must have tortured Wright in some way. And something I do think about each time I read that book.
Yeah. Here's a very presentist question. How do you think the past 5 years will affect Mississippi as it moves forward? Will we see history become a friend or an enemy? This is from Peggy Bolger.
The past 5 years. Yes, I mean, I do remember that my oft-tweeted quoted tweet on election day, "Good morning, America, welcome to Mississippi." That's a good question. I'm not sure I know. I'm hopeful that we have begun to learn our lessons. I just hope that that begins to filter down to our young people who then get out and vote. And it's really why I continue to teach these books, is that I reach a very small audience in Southern Studies, but I'm hoping that eventually the word gets out that, yes, we do need to look at this place in a new way.
Here's a question that's an important question that somebody wants to know, saying that Ralph, you and I are speaking of Mississippi as if we must just accept it with the conditions it has.
Oh no. Oh no. I mean,
I didn't know we were doing that, but yeah, I'm glad you said that.
No, I mean, I don't want to accept Mississippi the way that it is. It's not going to be that, that old altar call from the Baptist Church, just as I am without one plea. I do not accept Mississippi that way. And I really do think a lot about what it's going to take to transform this place, to change it. And as I said, I'm trying to do it one student at a time.
Well, that relates to something I was going to ask you a second ago. How do you, and this is a totally serious question, I would ask you this if we were just the two of us, how do you remain hopeful? about Mississippi, about, race in Mississippi, poverty in Mississippi. I mean, we could go down the list, but America, I mean, it's not just Mississippi, as we know.
it's I guess I remain hopeful because if I didn't, I would really fall into despair. And just to be perfectly blunt. So I have to keep that hope going. But what I do realize is there's a lot of work to be done. For example, when the Confederate statue came down at Ole Miss, I began to think of that not so much as, well, we've got that off the list. It's like that site where there's no statue is a reminder of what work there is to be done. And I did a story a year ago about 89 Black students at the University of Mississippi who were jailed for protesting. Some of them put into parchment, and continuing to document that work so that people know that story, don't forget that story, and perhaps even learn from that story. So I do keep those things going so that I'm hoping that eventually we will learn from that past. The last 5 years, I don't think that we have here. I'm afraid that we have seen ourselves go backward, and I can't let go. I mean, because I always say, Fannie Lou Hamer never gave up, so I can't do it either. So she's my inspiration. So if Fannie Lou Hamer could keep going, I can keep going too.
One last question here, and then we how dissimilar or how similar is Alabama and Mississippi? This person asked because the two states are often lumped together in a rather pejorative way, and this person may not realize that your family came from Alabama into Mississippi. In fact, I think you dedicate this book to Alabamans who
Alabamians who made me a Mississippian.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's interesting. The worst thing you could ever call my mother was a Mississippian. She thought she was an Alabamian to the core. The big difference that I've noticed between the two states, having looked at my grandparents' story, who were an interracial couple who married around 1915 in Alabama, that Mississippi has a top-down way of, I guess, the way that its society is constructed. Alabama is a series of island communities where local custom drives things in a way. That's a big difference between Alabama and Mississippi. Yes, some of the conservative politics in the place are the same, but the way that social structures, urban centers, it's a big difference between the two states. Mississippi only having Jackson. Mississippi has 3 great cities: Memphis, New Orleans, and Mobile.
Right.
So we are a state without a large urban core outside of Jackson. So that changes. That's another thing that makes us really different in Alabama. So yes, we're often lumped together, but couldn't be more different. And having spent time in both places and in both state archives, I think one of the things about Mississippi, I think we have confronted our civil rights history in a way, because of the Sovereignty Commission files, it's different than the way Alabama has. Now, yes, we had a Sovereignty Commission, which is different than Alabama, but there are other things that were going on in Alabama that at the same time that are parallel, but may not be accessible to someone trying to understand that period in Alabama's history. Mm-hmm. So that's another difference, the way we've had to confront our civil rights past.
Right. Can you, here's a question. Can you talk, Ralph, a little bit about your writing process, about how you go about doing what you do? You're very prolific. I mean, you had 3 or 4 pieces out this week.
Well, it's not like I sat down and wrote 4 pieces this week. So right. Is anyone's wondering? I do read a lot of poetry. Poetry is a big part of my writing process. but reading, a lot of writers say they can't read the work of other writers when they are working on their own work.
Mhm.
But since I'm a nonfiction writer, I think a lot about structure. Movement is really important to my writing process. A lot of my issues are worked out during exercising. I was a distance runner for many years. I've sadly just recently had to give that up. And it's the walking, which has become a much more meditative process where a lot of these things I work through. So it's motion, it's poetry, it's reading, it's music too. So all of those things are part of it. And I always tell people that Ever is a Long-Time soundtrack is Lucinda Williams' Car Wheels on a Gravel Road.
Right. What do you write out of, back to Welty's, that was written out of anger? How often do you see something that just you have to go write a piece about?
Oh,
Out of anger or just urgency?
oh yes. I think it was the hearing about the patriotic education bill in Mississippi that the governor tried to issue. I felt an urgency to write about that. So yes, there have been times. I think also, when the flag came down,
Right.
I felt an urgency to put that in some context, that I felt that people outside of writers who would be coming from outside of Mississippi, kind of coming in to do, a little parachute journalism, may not see.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so there are times when there's some urgency. There are also times when I have been asked to write about things that I've just said, I've written about that so much I can't. Someone asked me to write about, I can't remember about something related to lynching, and I just said I can't. There's nothing in the well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's just no, it's just there's nothing there, and I'm just going to be. I have ideas about it, but I can't do it.
Right. Right. What the dreaded question of what's next?
Oh,
never finish anything before somebody asks you what's next. But
I have long been, from my Oxford American piece from back in the fall, I've been thinking a lot about the Delta and my parents' time in Mileston, Mississippi. And as I said, there's been a lot more time in Mileston than I do at my parents' grave. And so the Delta is a place that really haunts me, because I feel that my father never wanted to leave. Because I think somehow he thought that he could change that place. And I guess I'm beginning to try to see in it maybe what my father wanted to change, and looking at the Delta with those kind of eyes. As a native son who never lived there. I mean, I guess one of the things that really haunts me is one of my dear friends, who's now gone, said to me over dinner one night, it wasn't anything out of anger, it was just factual. He said, your life would have been completely different had your family never left the Delta. And I think about that a lot. How that would have changed the course of my life. And thinking about the people who lived there, and how I would like to see the Delta get to a place where being from the Delta doesn't define the boundaries of what it is you can do.
Right. Right.
And I guess I've been thinking about, well, what would it take for that place to get there? And that's something I've been thinking about a lot.
And Mileston is such an interesting story. I mean, fascinating story. And
my dad ending up there, just fresh out of Tuskegee at the end of that, federal program, the resettlement program, and seeing the tail end of that, and realizing I think he got there thinking, I'm really going to be able to change something. You know, with it's that Tuskegean optimism. I guess maybe that's part of my optimism too. You know, I am always saying, "Damn you, Booker T. Washington! You're always haunting me." And I'm a Du Boisian through and through. But damn you, Booker T. Washington!
Well, there's an essay. That's great. Well, the thing about Milestone, that, and I would encourage you, I mean, you don't need me to encourage you, but the documentary archive from there is so rich and complex, and then your own, I mean, it's again one of these stories where you have a personal connection, but there's also this larger historical framework and material, and it seems just perfect for you to be in it, but not totally, you know, it's not only your story, but it is your story.
Yeah, I want to get that bigger story.
Yeah.
Not just the personal story, but
right.
Again, getting that bigger story, but
and the political story, the activist story, and the possibility, you know, what if story.
There is the what if story that I do think about each time.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's great. Well, we've probably kept these good people. It's 6:55. Does anybody have any other questions? And Ralph, is there, you know, anything else we haven't covered about your book other than that people need to go buy it?
No, I mean, I want to thank you for, you know, I think your work has been an inspiration to me about the way that you look at the South visually, and just wanted to thank you personally for that.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. I really do think your window in on, you know, photography and the way you talk about it, and but also the way you talk about time. I think back to, you know, this using Natasha's time and space. It reminds me too of Welty's quote, where, you know, that our inward journey always leads us through time, forward or back, seldom in a straight line. What does she say? Something like often spiraling.
Yeah.
You know, each of us is moving and changing, and you and your work is so rich in that way, acknowledging what needs to be said, but also seeing it in this larger frame. Even to hear you talk about reading, you know, rereading Black Boy, and, you know, and sort of trying to understand it, the same person trying to understand it across time.
Yeah, and it changes across time too.
And it changes, and that's, you know, that's the photographer's view oftentimes with what we're trying to do. I mean, it's the artist's view, but it's really wonderful. And this panoramic view of Mississippi literature in this book is such a gift, and I really do appreciate it. And I know everybody, you know, I mean, to have you sort of wrestle with this question that everybody gets asked: how in the world can one place have so much literature? And there's no, you know, I mean, well, there are lots of answers. I mean, people give answers all the time.
Yeah.
But you know, just how is it so? And this is a great answer to that question.
Well, thank you, Tom. Thank you.
So it's been wonderful, and I look forward to us being in person.
I do too.
And thank Tom and Dorothy for the best backdrop.
I will thank them, and I want to say thank you to Malaprops as well for hosting us tonight. It's been really wonderful, and
yeah,
looking forward to actually coming to Malaprops in Asheville in person at some point. So.
We look forward to seeing you in person. And I'm sorry, I realized that I popped my face up too soon. You were still having a really substantive conversation there. But I wanted to be ready so that you didn't, you know, so that you didn't feel like you were left hanging. So sorry, audience. Like, I know you aren't here to see me. But thank you so much. Ralph, I just want to echo what Tom said about what a gift this book is. In terms of our understanding or are at least processing, you know, Mississippi's role in literature in particular, and in so many ways in sort of just the American imagination, and then by extension the South, and you know, the way you explore the region, you know, as a place as well. So just so appreciative of that. And this has been a really wonderful conversation. We've gotten some lovely comments in the chat. And we thank you both so much. Just really
Thank
enjoyed
you.
listening to you.
And thank you. It's been
Thanks.
it's been a real delight.
Thank you. We do look forward to the opportunity to see you both sometime in person. The welcome mat is out for sure at Malaprops, and we look forward to that opportunity. To everyone out there, just a reminder that if you have the means, please do get a copy of A Place Like Mississippi. It's definitely worth it, and we appreciate you, and we hope that you stay safe and well until we can be with you virtually or see you in person. And thank you so much again for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Dennis.
Thank you.